Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dev Diary. And today is a special day because we're doing something that I have never done before. So remember that if you enjoyed today's video to leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss future videos. Now, I'm not sure how many of y'all out there know this, but gamemaker provides a bunch of asset packs for developers to use for free, and they are always adding new packs, including one in particular that I was very interested to see, an asset pack released in partnership with Kenny, which I'm now realizing that I've never actually heard anyone say out loud before, so apologies if Kenny is not pronounced that way. But anyway, for those of you who do not know, Kenny is a wonderful asset resource that provides a bunch of quality asset packs for free and under a Creative Commons license that allows for even commercial use. In other words, Kenny is an amazing resource for developers who may be on a budget or just starting to get their feet wet and can't afford their own assets. So to bring this back to Dev Diary, as much as I enjoy doing this series, it has evolved from just moving shapes to full-on specific art for each project, which is pretty much a weekly thing these days. In other words, it's a lot of work. And so I wanted to see what it would be like to make a game using someone else's assets, to see if it would ease the burden of development a bit and help me better manage my time. Well, spoilers, it didn't, but not for the reasons that you're thinking. Now, as mentioned before, I really wanted to use the gamemaker Cross Kenny release, and thus went for a survival action game in the process. The rule for this project was nothing could be made from scratch, and had to be made from an existing asset provided in the Kenny pack. So the floor tiles were broken up into 3 parts: the base level sand, the patches of grass, and elevated walls. Various grass, rocks, and cacti were then placed randomly in the world to be used as weapons. Yes, you heard right, grass is a weapon in this game. The entire premise behind this concept was that everything in the environment could be used as a weapon, so every prop that could make sense was turned into a weapon and broken down into 3 classes: throwable weapons, melee weapons, and guns. Guns are self-explanatory and all typical in nature: pistols to rocket launchers, the usual fare for a Dev Diary action game. Melee weapons include everything from a cactus to a road sign to trees and a lamppost. Throwables are similar in nature, with things as weak as grass and as strong as a gigantic skull. Each prop has its own weight values, damage, and a whole host of other variables to make them unique in their own attack viability. Players are able to pick up any of these props with E when near enough to one, and when picked up, the prop is moved off screen, so that should the player ever want to drop said prop, we can return it to the game world with all of its data still intact. Now, when a player has a prop equipped, they can attack with a left click, and the prop's class will determine the attack behavior. Throwables will literally throw the prop in the direction of the mouse cursor. The prop is put into a special state, which is the only state in which it can do any damage to the enemy, and it only lasts for a brief period of time, but in that time, if it hits an enemy, a usage counter drops by 1. When that thrown period is over, the prop returns to its idle state. If it's all out of uses, the prop is removed from the game, but if there are still uses available, it can then be picked up and used again. The melee class will spawn a slash effect, which is essentially just a hurt box, but if it comes in contact with an enemy, it will do damage to said enemy like one would assume with a melee weapon, and costing 1 usage on hit. Pretty straightforward, much like our guns who, behave exactly as one would expect guns to behave. They fire projectiles based on their weapon type, so pistols fire normal bullets, shotguns fire short-range slugs, grenade launchers fire grenades that can bounce off of walls, and of course, rocket launchers fire rockets. And fun fact, there didn't seem to be any assets for bullets or grenades, so I simply repurposed assets from the HUD sprites like this skull icon instead. Projectiles of course do damage to the enemies, and indeed grenades and rockets both explode, causing potential AoE damage to all nearby actors, including the player. Now the enemies are as basic as they come. Their only directive is to basically chase down the player, and despite having like 5 or 6 different enemies to work with, they all do the exact same thing. The only difference between the enemy types are the items that they drop upon being defeated, which are more tied to themes based on the character designs than anything. Now, a quick reminder before we continue that if you enjoy what I do here, supporting me on Patreon is the best way to help me keep doing it, and doing so can get you access to exclusive content and downloads, and even early access to the weekly Dev Diary videos. So there are 2 game over states that can occur. Either the player can survive the onslaught of enemies for 2 minutes, or they are overcome by the mob and touched to death. And that was basically the project. A weird mixture of like vampire survivors meets nuclear throne using assets from a game maker and Kenny crossover. On the surface, this should have been a cakewalk because the lovely art provided by Kenny should have taken a huge weight off of my shoulders. Unfortunately, I am me, and thus that free time turned into spending time on feature creep that eventually forced me to stop. Because, as it turns out, I ended up spending about 2 or 3 times more on this than anticipated, putting me like way behind schedule. And as a result, there was just so much cut that I wanted to implement. For example, weight was supposed to be a way to balance weapons. Stronger weapons would be heavier, so they would be harder to throw, and they were meant to slow the player down. Didn't have time to implement the math for that, and the throw weight is severely broken. The enemies were all supposed to have different behaviors. Some were meant to chase the player, others were meant to be projectile based or dash around, but didn't have time to implement them either. Unfortunately, I got so caught up on adding more and more props, that things just quickly ballooned out of control. First it was just guns, and then it was melee, and then it was throw bows, and then the modification to how props work, to make them viable as different classes, and so on and so on. And so long story short, this was really fun. Like, working with someone else's assets to make something bonkers was fun, but at the same time, it was so dangerous. Usually having to work on assets for Dev Diary projects helps me keep things in scope, because anything that has to be added will usually need an asset, so it's easier to balance the feature creep. But here, having a trove of just quality assets that only take a bit of editing to turn into 10 different other ideas, it's just really easy to get carried away. But despite this, I would love to come back and finish this project in some capacity. And in fact, I would love to highlight wonderful resources like Kenny more often. So please let me know if you enjoy this type of video and would like to see it return in the future, because there is so much more potential for more ideas that I would love to explore. If you're all willing to come along for the ride, that is. But with that said, brings us to the end of today's Dev Diary, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.